Hey everybody, it is Jack Murphy here from jackmurphylive.com. Welcome to the first episode of the Jack Murphy Live podcast. After many requests, I have finally pulled the trigger and we are doing this for real. The goal of this podcast is to bring you guys experts in a cross-section of fields to help us all better understand the world around us. Personally, I love in-depth conversations with interesting, intelligent people, and I love to hear what they have to say when given more than just a 2-minute segment on air. On this podcast, we're going to cover a wide range of topics like politics, culture, sex and relationships, the media, and more. We're going to have a couple of rotating regulars like my good friend Will Chamberlain, who is a legal expert and a political commentator, as well as my lovely girlfriend, the Red Hen, to give us a female's perspective at times. Be prepared. The subject material is going to bounce around a lot and cover a lot of different ground. And some of it is definitely adult only, not for vulgarity or anything like that, but because of adult themes like sex and relationships. Like I said, people have been asking me to do this for a long time, and I'm excited to get started. I think one of the best skills in my skill stack is asking people probing questions and guiding them along interesting threads and then tying it all together and relating it to the big picture. The guest list that we have coming up is exciting, and it is totally blowing my mind. There are multiple PhDs lined up, high-profile experts in their fields, high-ranking government officials, as well as well-known journalists and established independent media types. The content is going to be a little edgy, but it will be very informative and always super interesting. And my first guest is certainly all of those things. His name is Geoffrey Miller, and he is an evolutionary psychologist with an undergraduate degree from Columbia University and a PhD from Stanford in cognitive psychology. He is currently a tenured professor at the University of New Mexico. Geoffrey has written over 100 academic papers, countless articles, and he's published 4 books, including The Mating Mind and a book called Mate, or What Women Want. He has given lectures all over the world. He's taught at New York University, London School of Economics, and UCLA. His work has been featured in Nature, Science, the New York Times, Washington Post, The Economist, CNN, NPR, National Geographic, etc., etc. You get the picture. Needless to say, Geoffrey is a bona fide expert in his field and a fascinating guy to talk to. But before we get to all that, I want to mention that this podcast is brought to you by Democrat to Deplorable, Why 9 Million Obama Voters Ditched the Democrats and Embraced Donald Trump. This is a book that I wrote myself and I published earlier this year. It's got a ton of original research. It's not just some guy ranting into the ether. I conducted a national survey with over 1,500 respondents to 67 questions, so I have a treasure trove of original research and data. I interviewed people over Skype from all over the country, and I even got in my car and just drove around trying to talk to the real people who once voted for Barack Obama, but then decided to ditch the Democrats and embrace Donald Trump. There's 9 million people. There's 9 million people that did that. And in an election in 2016, which was decided by 77,000 votes over 3 states, there's no question that the Democrat to Deplorable voting bloc is one of the most powerful voting blocs in America. My book takes a very deep dive into the cultural, political, economic, and all kinds of reasons that created the environment in which these people who proudly voted for Barack Obama also proudly voted for Donald Trump. This book is not Trump, is the greatest thing in the whole world kind of thing. I'm not a Trump sycophant by any means. And it's not necessarily a book just straight bashing Hillary Clinton. In fact, the tone of the book is disarming. It's interesting, it's engaging, and it's really the stories of the people who had their transformation and their transformative experience, which brought them to ditch the Dems and embrace Donald Trump. So go out there and get a copy. You can find it on Amazon.com. Also, please, when you're done reading, leave a review if you know the good, bad, or the ugly. The more reviews that I get, the more Amazon is likely to start promoting it to the rest of the people on their website, and that's a good way to get the message out. You can also find out more from me by following me on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. Go to my website and check out all of the essays. There's like 75 essays there from the last 3 years at jackmurphylive.com. While you're there, sign up for my email list and get exclusive members-only content as well as pre-release and early release essays before they're launched and sent out to the public at large. But now it is time for us to get to our first guest, Geoffrey Miller. I interviewed him while I was in New Mexico this week. I was scheduled to speak at the University of New Mexico Law School as part of my Democrat to Deplorable 2018 fall tour. But as my bags were packed and I was just getting ready to go to bed for my early flight the next day, I found out that the faculty member at the law school who had sponsored me, who had paid for my flight and paid for my hotel and arranged the talk and promoted it, she had just been told that the talk had to be canceled. The head of the law school called her in along with security, and they told her that they had received threats and that they were worried about the security, and they thought that it was too dangerous to have a political discussion so close to the midterm elections. This was the day before the midterms. And so they banned me and deplatformed me because of what is in Democrat to Deplorable and the message that I'm trying to bring. I'm out here building bridges and people are trying to tear me down. So that should give you a good idea of the climate that we're operating in. But being the guy that I am, after they canceled me, I still decided to go. I'm like, hey, my flight's paid for, the hotel's paid for. Plus, I had two very interesting and important interviews set up. And one of them was with Geoffrey Miller. And so while I was out there, Geoffrey was kind enough to bring me into his home. We sat down at his dining room table. And after we got to know each other a little bit, we let the tape go and started talking. What follows is about an hour and 45 minutes of an in-depth conversation that spans a multitude of topics, including evolutionary psychology, mating patterns among humans, relationships, new kinds of relationships, politics, culture, feminism, masculinity, femininity, and how all these things are tied together. And we talk about the factors that influence things from a macro level all the way to the Supreme Court and the presidency of the United States, all the way down to our relationships and down to the dining room table. And so without further ado, I present to you the first episode of Jack Murphy Live Podcast with Geoffrey Miller. Thank you for listening. Hey, Geoffrey.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing really good. Thanks for having me here.
It's my pleasure, Jack.
We are here at Geoffrey's home in Albuquerque, and he's been so gracious to invite me to the dining room table to sit down and have a talk. We had connected over Twitter some time ago, and we've been communicating about various issues. And one thing that we had a little discussion over that I want to get to eventually here was Jordan Peterson had a brouhaha in the press when he was talking about his notion of enforced monogamy.
Yeah.
And I brought that up thinking that it was very interesting how Jordan Peterson was able to trigger people into sort of advocating for the breakdown of the traditional family as a way to just argue with Jordan Peterson. And you said that you wanted to have a talk about that, and I thought that was great, and I would definitely like to get to that. But the first thing I wanted to talk about is just sort of lead in was we were talking earlier about your experience in writing a book with Tucker Max. And I was hoping you could share sort of how you came to work with him and what that experience was like and sort of some of your takeaways, from that.
I think Tucker had read my Spent book and really enjoyed it. It was about consumerism and business and how people sort of signal their traits through the goods and services that they buy and display. And I happened to be in a social psych conference in Austin, Texas, where Tucker lives, a few years ago, and we happened to get together for dinner, and we talked about kind of the difficulties that young men face in dating and the ignorance they have about evolution and women and mate choice and kind of what vector to go in, what direction to try to develop in. And so Tucker and I decided we should write a book together, and that ended up being the Mate book, Mate in hardback or What Women Want in paperback. And we tried to integrate the evolutionary psychology that I know and that he'd actually read quite a bit about with his sort of real life experience of interacting with a lot of women and being in the dating scene for a while. We learned a lot from doing our podcast, The Mating Grounds, where young men would call in with their issues and we would kind of give them advice.
What were some of the main issues? So you said that he identified that the young men were having problems today, and I think right now the popularity of Jordan Peterson filling up not arenas but large halls all across the world. Actually now it's like thousands of people. It's speaking to the fact that there's sort of a lost boys generation out there. So what did you and Tucker identify as being some of the problems?
I think the number one thing was that a lot of young men don't really have the perspective-taking ability. They can't really put themselves in the heads or the shoes of women and ask, well, what's it like to be a woman? What's their perspective? What do they really want? And how can I sort of deliver it to them? How can I make myself into the kind of guy who's actually attractive and compelling to women? And, we know from psychology that men are not as good at that kind of perspective-taking or mind-reading as women are. So when men go into the dating scene in high school or college, they really don't have a lot of good advice from the culture or their parents about what is happening realistically between the sexes.
But they're getting some advice somewhere.
They're getting a lot of sort of misleading advice that tends to be either sort of very politically correct that pretends there's no sex differences, or they're reading pickup artist kind of red pill stuff, which has a lot of merit to it, but makes some key mistakes, in my humble opinion. So what we wanted to do is kind of...
We'll get back to that.
Yeah, I hope so. We tried to offer a kind of perspective that's based on science, but also based on, the lived experience that Tucker and I had in our own relationships.
And what did you guys sort of identify as an attitude or a perspective that young men were getting from culture and society that was inaccurate or even misleading or even detrimental?
I think there was a lot of misunderstanding about power dynamics in relationships, where a lot of guys thought, okay, either I have to be Mr. Nice and super agreeable and basically beg for sex and be a kind of feminist ally and try to insinuate myself into a woman's affections through a kind of almost political manipulation. Or I have to go to the opposite extreme. I have to make myself into a kind of psychopathic alpha male who doesn't have any empathy or consideration for women or any degree of agreeableness. And there again, we tried to make a sort of middle path that says women are very attracted to power and dominance and status and prestige and confidence. That is true. But women also want to see the qualities in a man that would make for a long-term partner, a good dad. And a lot of that depends on agreeableness and kindness and understanding the woman's point of view and your future children's points of view, right? Psychopaths don't make good dads. And that's the argument we made, that men have to become what we call tender defenders. They have to be capable of defending women and kids, and women have to trust that that's true, but they also have to be tender most of the time.
I think some people that I know would say that that's building a better beta. Have you heard that phrase before?
Yeah, and I understand that perspective, but I think the whole alpha beta terminology is very misleading. I think that those are great concepts if you're describing gorillas, where there really is a sort of alpha beta hierarchy. Likewise with orangutans. But humans lived in, social tribal groups for a very long time. We have multiple sources of status, not just one. We don't just rely on physical dominance. We rely on intelligence, creativity, reputation, how much value we can add to the group, what our moral virtues are, etc. And that's how humans typically get status and what makes us attractive to each other. So any given group, maybe there's one leader, but not everybody can be a leader. Not all guys can sort of be the so-called alpha, nor should they try to be, nor is that necessarily the morally best thing to be, nor is society better off if all the guys are trying to compete to be the alpha.
Right.
I think you can certainly have a leveling up of confidence. I think that's the key thing. If young men figure out, how do I build skills that give me legitimate confidence and a sense of self-worth? That's great. But don't confuse that with trying to be the top dog.
I remember when Jordan Peterson broke onto the scene, he used the phrase dominance hierarchies quite a bit. And I think over time he started to actually swap that phrase out for, I believe, competence hierarchies. Now, is that what you're sort of getting at, sort of the difference there? Because I think it's pretty clear that we exist in a hierarchy. And I'm curious to understand your perspective on does that hierarchy start in aggregate and work its way all the way down to the family level and within our familial relationships with our spouses, with our children, and our community? So if you could speak to that, dominance versus competence, is it the same thing? Is it different? And where and when and how do they start or stop?
Yeah, I think, Jack, this is a really good question, and it's very confusing to a lot of people. So on the one hand, you have a social status hierarchy, which is within a group, who is recognized as having the highest status, second highest, etc. And people typically agree on this. There is a consensus, like this person is more of a leader, this person is more of a quiet follower. But separately from that, there's a spectrum of competence or capability. And the main thing Tucker and I argued in the Mate book is fundamentally women are attracted to competence, even if it doesn't show up at the moment in the status hierarchy. So if a guy is really good at doing all kinds of things, hunting, fighting, taking care of his friends, socializing, building his reputation, displaying signs of confidence and capability, that is extremely attractive to most women most of the time. And you can do that even if you're not in a kind of leadership position, right? You can even do that if you're a high school sophomore. Or of course you're not the top dog because there are juniors and seniors kind of above you. And that's what we try to encourage the young men to do, is kind of don't worry about your status or your dominance. First, build your competence. Get good at lots of things.
Mm-hmm. And these hierarchies, do they find their way into our family structures as well? Or are those more egalitarian, or how does that work?
Well, I think in any given relationship, there's a power dynamic where typically one person has or ends up with a little bit more power than the other person. A lot of that has to do with relative mate value, right? Whoever has a little bit higher mate value overall, whoever has more options, has more bargaining power in a relationship. If it would be easier for them to leave, they have more bargaining power, they tend to be more dominant.
Well, do you find in your research and in your time with the podcast and talking to people that women will willingly enter into a relationship in which they have higher status or a higher sort of mate value relative to their male partner? And if they do, is that satisfying?
You do see that, but I think typically the happiest, most stable, most successful relationships have two qualities. One, there's kind of a division of labor with regard to competence, so that the woman might be stronger and better at certain things, the guy is stronger and better at other things, and they complement each other, and they're a good match in that regard. So the guy might think, oh man, she's kind of dominant to me with regard to certain issues, but I'm dominant to her with regard to other domains of life or other issues. My dad's favorite joke, for example, is, in a happy marriage, the woman makes, the really trivial decisions like where they live, who they socialize with, where they send the kids to school,
the trivial decisions,
how to spend their money, what house to buy. And the man makes the important decisions like how we should relate to China and what about Brexit and so forth. And I think there's a grain of truth in that often women have a lot of kind of hidden private power over money and parenting and how the relationship goes and the couple's social life. And the man thinks he's sort of dominant because maybe he's got stronger political opinions, or maybe he makes the money, but the woman spends more of it, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So it's, in this case, it's a sort of a mirage.
Yeah, I think it's a mirage. And I think smart women throughout history have always known that they have quite a bit more power than their husbands think they have.
I heard a phrase once that said, "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world."
Yeah. And of course, women also have a lot of power to shape the abilities and ethics of the next generation, as moms and as people who kind of set the moral tone for society in a way.
Mm-hmm. I saw a Pew study that showed that women's mate preferences are for men with a higher education level and perhaps a higher earning income potential. In the United States now, where women outnumber men on college campuses, I think it's 3-2, and growing. And fewer men are getting college educations. More and more women are getting college educations. I've seen studies that show that in 148 out of 150 metropolitan areas in the United States, women, recent graduates, are out earning their male counterparts. How do you see that playing out in terms of mate choice, mate selection, happiness within relationships, etc.?
I think it can be very tough if people don't kind of update their mate preferences. So there's a tradition in America of women not wanting to marry somebody who makes less than them, right?
Now, is that a tradition, or is that something that has evolved over time as a way to survive and to evolve, into the best that they can be?
I think in a way it is a tradition, but it's a deep tradition. I think it goes back to kind of the invention of agriculture, 10,000 years ago. I think ever since then, women who have been in groups that did city-states and agriculture and inherited land and wealth have been under a lot of pressure, and I mean literal evolutionary selection pressure, to do the hypergamy thing, to find guys who have land and wealth and an expected future stream of wealth. And the women who didn't care about that in those groups kind of died out. So we're left with women who are concerned about that.
Is 10,000 years enough time to make such a change or a dent in our sort of aggregate expression of our genes and preferences?
Sure, why not? I mean, look at how quickly hundreds of different dog breeds diverged from just a few different subspecies of wolves in the last... I mean, most of those breeds are only a few hundred years old.
But isn't that like that's a controlled environment where like humans are dictating that evolution? But I mean, sort of left to the genetic marketplace, is 10,000 years really enough time to make such a profound change? I mean, I guess the question I'm asking is, does this preference go back further than 10,000 years?
Yeah, if you study, hunter-gatherer tribal societies, you certainly also see this tendency towards hypergamy, where the women will pay quite a bit of attention to who's got dominance, status, prestige, who's a good hunter. If you're hanging around the campfire at night, which guy says things that everybody else listens to versus which guys don't say anything or, say dumb stuff that everybody ignores. They pay a lot of attention to that, of course. But I think the focus on wealth is perhaps relatively new, and I think we should distinguish between, like, hunting ability is one thing, but making a professional living in a complex market economy is a different thing.
Right. So it seems to me that a female reaction to a successful expression of like physicality is maybe an instinctual response, whereas reaction to your wealth and income may be calculated.
Well, I think they're both instinctual responses. One just goes back further than the other. I think females of almost all species that we've studied generally have a tendency to prefer to mate with males that are physically larger, stronger, healthier, more energetic, more capable.
Than their female counterpart, or than male
other
competitors?
Males, than other males.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happens to this mating process, this sorting process, when you have fewer and fewer men, attaining higher levels of education and income, and then you combine it with a popular culture that seems to be denigrating masculinity and male performance? What is that going to do to the the innate wiring of a 22-year-old woman today who is trying to find her place in the mating market, but maybe there's a contradiction from what she's seeing culturally than what she's feeling on the inside.
But yeah, it's a great question. If I was a 22-year-old woman in modern society, I imagine I would be really, really frustrated, because I would have these kind of instinctual attractions to certain male traits that are in relatively short supply, partly due to the technology and the economy and the culture and so forth. But I would also be kind of feeling guilty about having those preferences.
Where does that guilt come from?
I think it's from a kind of politically correct ideology and gender feminism that says you should be going for men who aren't necessarily physically strong and capable, but are just nice and allies, that you should go for men who have the right ethical values rather than necessarily the best future earners or the ones who are socially or professionally competent. And so men aren't living up to women's standards, but also I think women aren't being very articulate about what they're really wanting.
Really? When you say that, the first thing I think of is Sheryl Sandberg and her book where she says that, you should date all the bad boys and have fun with them until you're ready to settle down and then find yourself a good little earner. I mean, that to me seems to be pretty darn explicit.
I think that's not the worst advice I've heard.
But for the guy, I mean, I think this is something that people are really feeling right now, which is, there's a difference between being desired by your mate for your innate physicality or your sexuality, or your just brutishness, as it were, versus being perceived as a valuable business partner, and then valuable for your sort of economic or contribution to the relationship. And I think that the former makes people feel like, with increased vitality. It makes them feel excited. It makes them feel awesome. But to be the guy who gets married, to the woman in her 30s, then who's now the one who's going to be like, oh, the good dad, or the good earner, good provider, good partner. I think that makes guys feel kind of used.
Yeah, well, there's that. I mean, men are status objects and women are sex objects, and neither of us like to be treated as objects in that kind of way, in that sort of transactional way. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing is that, there's a difference between, guys get very confused about this. Like, you're a big, strong guy, and some guys are kind of born that way. That's their genetics. But whatever your genes are, it's like not that hard to stay in pretty good shape if you work at it a bit. And you don't have to be, the strongest MMA fighter on campus to be attractive to women. I think women are often just looking for a certain basic minimum level of literal physical fitness. Mm-hmm. And like, if you're fit enough to walk around and do stuff and have vigorous sex and, be active in multiple ways, that's good enough. But a lot of guys aren't reaching that standard.
No, definitely not. And I think that what we've seen is that the importance for keeping yourself in good shape and for just general basic fitness, and with obesity and all the unhealthy behaviors that we've accepted in our culture today, that I think is also feeding into this general dissatisfaction everybody's having in the mating market. And maybe I'm making a broad generalization when I'm saying like general dissatisfaction, but I think your experience with the podcast and the book, what Jordan Peterson is saying, what I've seen in my own writing, what guys I've talked to, be they red pill writers or just general, masculinity, writers, everybody's sort of getting the same sense out there that there's a disenchantment, people are disappointed, things aren't working the way that they're supposed to work. And I think it's because we're giving people the wrong messages. And we're also building a society in which women are sort of building themselves up into a situation in which other men are just going to just fail them. They're just not going to generate that innate sexual desire. And I keep coming back to that because for me personally, I was in a marriage that was just crashed and burned, and I had fallen apart. I had gotten fat, and I was out of shape, and I was drinking too much, and I wasn't doing anything that would generate desire from my ex-wife. And once I got divorced, I realized I wasn't doing anything that was going to generate desire in anybody, right? So I figured out through trial and error that I had to like get my ass in shape, and I had to work out, and I had to become physically fit and physically dominant and carry myself in a way that exuded that, irrespective of whatever my intellectual capabilities were, my professional capabilities. And that was a difficult lesson to learn, because I think maybe there's a sense of entitlement out there with guys, and they haven't put it together yet that it's sort of like all on them. And that's my main message that I'm bringing to guys, which is that it's all on you, and that you have the capability to make a change in your life that's going to manifest itself in better, healthier, more satisfying relationships with both your significant others and just your friends and people around you. And where's that message today?
Yeah, and I mean, the weird thing is, I agree with everything you just said. People think of this as kind of a marginal issue compared to like, the election or whatever. But actually, a civilization that doesn't offer a viable mating market, and that doesn't offer norms and standards and, habits and institutions that allow young men to meet young women and get together and have relationships and have babies and have families, that's a failed civilization.
Right. And not just get together and have babies, but have long-lasting, satisfying relationships, right? Because it seems to be a phenomenon where people can get together in the chemical lust, passionate period of love, and have a baby, but then like 2 or 3 years later, they realize, like our triggers aren't being hit here, and nobody's happy, and there's a lot of divorce like around that time. I don't have any hard statistics on it, but anecdotally, I've seen it, I've experienced it myself. It's interesting, you're absolutely right about a society that fails to sort of clear the mating market is a doomed society in the long run. And I first, my book, Democrats and Deplorables, is about politics and culture, but I started writing about relationship issues just like this, and through my own personal experience. I mean, everything that I've written about has been through my own personal experience, trial and error, a first-person narrative, and like really trying to share what's happened to me in the past and put that out there for people in a raw and honest way. And in doing that, I realized that the issues that were affecting our dating and mating markets and disrupting the bedroom were also disrupting the nation and disrupting our politics and our culture, or vice versa, or whatever. But they're all related and intertwined. And going to shift subject here just a little bit, but it came down to sort of this radical feminism and modern feminism today, and sort of this desire to wipe out the differences between men and women, both on a obvious physical level, on a performative level, in professions and jobs, and this demand that everybody and everything be completely equal, and that if you suggest otherwise, you're a racist, bigoted, homophobe, or sexist, misogynist, and whatnot. And when I saw the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, the Supreme Court recently, and I heard the Senate Judiciary Committee people, the senators up there, using the language of radical feminism and using these concepts and ideologies about believe all women, because all sexes can be rape, and rape is all about power, and we must believe all survivors. And these things, you can, a real feminist scholar could track that all the way back into the feminist literature, but to see it burst forth onto the biggest national platform that there is, with the Supreme Court hearings and the president's involved. And it really hammered home to me that all these things that I've been discovering through trial and error were not insane, right? And I'm not crazy. And this stuff is real, and it's really happening, and it's really putting, it's really divisive, and it's really, I think if we don't do something about it, it's going to have some long-term damaging consequences. What do you think about that?
Yeah, we're at a peak of mistrust between the sexes, and I think it's that's the real toxicity. It's not toxic masculinity, it's toxic mistrust. And I think it's fed by kind of media and academic culture that exaggerates America's problems extremely. Like the rate of rape in America has fallen by at least half, or maybe 3 times compared to the early 90s.
Oh yeah, I mean the chart is just a steady downward slope for as far back as you can look.
And the overall level, like in the U.S. compared to, like, India has a real rape problem. India is very sexist, patriarchal. Porn is outlawed. You know, young men are sexually frustrated. There's not a culture of sort of casual sex, etc. So they have a huge problem of sexual coercion. There is a big problem of sexual coercion in America, but it's gradually kind of fading away for various reasons. But the more overblown it is by the media, the harder it is for young people to go on dates and feel.
But is it just the media that's overblowing it? I mean, I went to the protests out in front of the Supreme Court, and there was a woman up there. So she was the executive director of Rape Ed on campus, and she said 1 in 3 women on campus will be victims of sexual violence this year. Now, I understand that they have taken the surveys and the questions, and they've expanded what it means to be a victim of sexual assault. And it's really, down now, even if you looked at the wrong way, but I'm exaggerating here, but basically they expanded the definition. And, these studies the big scare number was 1 in 5, and that was 1 in 4, and now it's 1 in 3. So is the rate of sexual violence on college campus, has it really gone up that much to 1 in 3? I mean, if this was a real number, would you or any other father in America send your daughter to a college campus? And so this hysteria is not just from the media, these are nonprofits, these are people working, these are advocacy groups, these are people.
Right, advocacy groups, nonprofits that often have a vested interest in overblowing these statistics. But this is generally true for nonprofits, right? Like World Wildlife Fund will exaggerate the rate of extinction, and Greenpeace will exaggerate the rate of global warming. I mean, of course, everybody who has a sort of vested interest in a problem wants to make the problem seem really big. But the best statistics show rates of sexual coercion are dropping on campuses, and it's much safer for a young woman to be on a campus than not to be on a campus. Right. And that message is getting lost. And also, I think there's such an expanded definition of what kinds of relationships between men and women are problematic. Like, for example, the idea that if you're tipsy, you can't give any consent. A lot of the 1 in 3 stats are basically women who hook up when they're tipsy, because it's considered to be sexually coercive if they're, tipsy.
And what I found interesting about those studies is that at the end they ask them, did you report this? And they don't. The self-reporters on these tests and these quizzes say they don't report them. Well, why didn't they report them? Because they didn't feel like it was sexual violence. But then the people who are doing the studies,
and the researchers say
it was sexual violence. Yeah. Right, exactly.
And I've asked my own university, like, okay, what exactly is our policy? Let's say if two gay students get together and they're both tipsy and they have sex. Who raped who, or did they both rape each other, or was it not rape according to our policies? And there is no answer for that.
Right. And that seems like it seems like we must be living in some sort of bizarre world where that actually becomes a valid question, but it is a valid question. And in the context of seeing the Supreme Court hearing dominated by these ideas, it's no longer just a fringe thing to think about, I don't think. I think that this is now in the mainstream. It's affecting our government. It's affecting our culture. It's affecting us on aggregate. And it's going to affect our mating and mating sorting and our genetic development. So this, to me, is, I don't think it's an existential problem, but, maybe it's approaching that. I mean, this is something that I think needs a lot more attention and a solution. What do you think we do about this?
Well, look, if you're talking about, let's say, government policy at the economic level, the first thing to ask from like my libertarian perspective is what could be the unanticipated consequences or the side effects of the policy, or how will people respond to the new incentives in ways you might not have predicted and that might be counterproductive. People don't tend to do that when they get in the sexual realm of talking about, well, we should adopt these sexual norms and values. They don't typically ask, okay, if we do that, what are the unanticipated side effects? Like if you have new policies on campus that basically disincentivize students from dating other students, well, okay, they'll date non-students or they won't date at all and maybe become frustrated and depressed. So what are those costs? Nobody seems to be asking those kinds of questions. But I see it like when I teach my human sexuality class, I'll sometimes ask the students, how do you guys feel about dating somebody else on campus? And a lot of the guys will say, I wouldn't dare. It is too risky. Why the hell would I expose myself to the risk of somebody misinterpreting something or having regrets about a date or a sexual experience? And so they're basically deterred from forming relationships. And when I went to college in the 80s, we had relationship problems, but we didn't worry about the university kind of being like this draconian rule enforcer.
No, because they had just spent the 60s and 70s kicking the universities out of the dormitory bedrooms, right?
Yeah, they said, we don't want in loco parentis. We don't want the universities to take the place of, parents in our dating lives. We want sexual freedom. Right. And now we've basically lost all that.
Well, I see this as a major issue facing us culturally and politically. And in my research and my experiences, I would tie this back to Title IX regulations and back to the Obama era changes to the sexual harassment policies and procedures, and the way that it was Joe Biden in particular who got, sort of convinced by some radical feminists that it was 1 in 5, the number was 1 in 5 then, that the 1 in 5 number was really real, and this was a rape epidemic, right? This was a national crisis that needed to be handled. And so from Washington, and I'm working in education too, so I'm very familiar with the way that federal policy, education policy tied to money can manifest itself in our society and our relationships and change human behavior. And so the way I see it is that there's like this web reaching out from Washington, D.C. that was politically motivated, that then changed the incentive structure for universities across the country, who under the threat of losing their money have now expanded, if not just from like preventing women from being harassed to the point that they can't get their education, but now they have to actually stamp out any sense of harassment sort of before it happens. I think something like 250 colleges across the country have these things called bias response teams, where students are instructed to rat on each other if somebody says anything that's offensive. And these things sound absolutely insane if you're just sort of sticking your toe into this conversation for the first time. But these are facts. I mean, this is real stuff. And so to me, I see it as being all politically related, and I think that we have like sort of a new crisis on our hands instead of the fake crisis. and it comes from the democratic policies and the sort of infiltration of radical feminism into the Democratic Party. And so to me, it looks like a major national issue. The fact that there's kids in your classes that say that they won't date each other on campus. So how do my listeners, how do my readers, what do we do about this? Like, how do we make these changes? Because I'll be honest, I was practically a single issue voter with Donald Trump when he alluded to making Title IX reforms, and my just big hopes that he was gonna. That to me was such a high leverage issue that sort of sealed it for me. So what's your take on that?
I think it is important for listeners to understand that virtually all of the ideological pressure on campuses comes from the left, not from the right. If it came from the right, I would not have been able to teach a class on polyamory and open sexuality. I would be terrified of what I teach in my regular human sexuality class in terms of potential conservative blowback, because I cover a lot of kind of edgy topics. I cover the history of gay rights, I cover kink and BDSM, I cover hypergamy, I cover a lot of that stuff that many American conservatives, particularly, Christian conservatives, would find like maybe they don't want their kids to hear about that stuff. But they have no voice. Nobody in higher education administration is listening to Christian conservatives about what their complaints are. They are listening to the left. They are listening to gender feminists. So this isn't just an issue of dating on campus. It's also an issue of what are professors allowed to teach. Because remember, Title IX originally was about equal access basically to college athletics. Now it's turned into extremely strong constraints on free speech, because a lot of universities have policies now that say, if you say anything that any student considers to be sexist or stereotyping, they can report it to administrators, and then you as a faculty member can be censured and punished because you're saying something sexist. Okay, how do you define that? It could potentially be any scientific claim about sex differences.
Well, the James Damore Google memo issue came up, and I'm just going to assume basic understanding from our audience on what happened there. But the National Labor Review Board, when they went over the complaint, in their response, they said that any discussion of sexual differences in personality, aptitude, or capabilities was considered harassment.
Yeah, and that's where we're at as America. And it's insane because the amount of scientific evidence for those differences is very strong. It's at least as strong as the evidence for, let's say, global warming. But one of those issues, there's a line that we're supposed to follow that, yeah, you get the point.
Right. Well, which makes me laugh because the folks on the left will say that the people on the right are science deniers. But when it comes to gender and sexuality and whatnot, it's definitely people on the left that are the science deniers here.
Absolutely. Yeah, the left tends to often believe in kind of blank slate views that basically deny the evolution of human.
Would you explain that concept for people that are listening, please? Because I think this is really crucial also to our political coalitions. I think that we're sorting around this idea, actually.
Okay, so the blank slate is the view that evolution may have shaped our bodies to have human form, but it didn't really have any significant effect on our minds other than just endowing us with a general purpose learning capacity that means we can soak up ideas from culture and from other people. So if you're a blank slater, then you believe that very few psychological traits are heritable in the sense that individuals will resemble their parents for genetic rather than just cultural reasons. And also, you don't tend to believe that there are significant evolved differences between the sexes. You tend to believe there aren't sort of heritable personality traits. You tend not to believe there's such a thing as general intelligence that's heritable and that differs between people. And the left has basically always been the side of blank slaters because they want people to be naturally good and perfectible, preferably through state intervention. And they really don't want to think about any innate differences between people or between species or between the sexes.
But this is clearly contradicted by data.
Yeah. And I think Steven Pinker's best book is called The Blank Slate, and you should read it if you believe in the blank slate, because it will tear your mind anew, opening into reality.
No, they'll just set it on fire.
They'll burn it. It's heresy. But
what's amazing about that book is it was written, I think, in 2000, 2002, something like that. Mm-hmm. And when you read it today, and it seems like, because I read it again just like a year ago, and it reads like case closed.
Yeah.
Right? Like blank slate is it does not exist. Period. End of story. Next discussion. But in the preface to the latest edition, he's like, I can't believe we're still having this debate. And I can't believe that this is still an issue. And I would argue that it's even more pronounced than it was 15 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. It sure is. And the crazy thing about it is if you actually care about other people and a society where everyone is cared for, it's really helpful to acknowledge that there are heritable individual differences in intelligence and conscientiousness, meaning willpower, and lots of traits. So not everybody is going to be able to become an Elon Musk. In fact, not everybody may be as capable of finishing college and learning through college textbooks and lectures. And that's okay. But instead, the left has adopted this delusional fantasy that says if you just shove enough education down people's throats, everyone can be competitive in a global, information and technology-based economy. And that leads to disillusionment, disappointment, frustration, shame, victim blaming. And it actually leads to a nation where everybody who is successful looks down with total contempt on everybody who isn't successful. And you see that with the elite attitudes towards, let's say, Trump voters.
Right. Well, so I'm 6'4", so I've been blessed genetically with height, but I played basketball in high school, and I'm not blessed genetically enough with height or athleticism to become like a college basketball player or a professional basketball player. And I guarantee you that professional basketball player does not look at me with contempt because I'm incapable of playing professional basketball based on my genetics. And I'm also not the most dominant guy in every room. I mean, most of the time, but not all the time. I'm not the smartest guy. I haven't been the leader in every situation that I've been in. And you know what? I'm okay with that. Maybe it's because I do have a relatively high, status in my, circles and whatnot. But I think that there is a certain assumption that people are incapable of acknowledging their place in the hierarchy and would feel somehow, I don't know, angry, hateful, something else horribly negative if, when they, understand that their place, where it is. And I think that this blank slate stuff is a way to, as you said, find a perfectibility in the human condition and human performance. But then it leads exactly to what you're saying, which is, well, if you didn't succeed, then you just didn't try hard enough.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to me, a fundamental question for civilizations that have, a population with a distribution of traits is not what's the upper limit of success if you have extraordinary abilities. Rather, it's does your society give people with an IQ of 100 and an average degree of willpower a reasonable shot at finding a mate and having a family and doing meaningful work and having self-respect. And if a society can't offer that to literally average people, if it kind of sweeps that issue under the rug, that's a failed society. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something the left is not willing to engage with. Mm-hmm. You can't solve that problem by just expanding the welfare state or teaching everybody gender feminism or, calling everybody racist. Those aren't viable solutions.
Well, and there's other things that come out of this blank slate notion, which is that gender, sort of is a social construct that's not innate to your biology, and that our hormones, for example, don't have anything to do with the way that we behave. Now, I'm on hormone replacement therapy. I got my testosterone levels checked when about 8 years ago, maybe, and it was about 300, and that's really low for a guy my age at the time. And I got on testosterone replacement therapy, and it elevated my mood. It reduced my anxiety. It gave me a little bit more confidence, and it made me feel much better. People seek out hormone therapy for its enhancement on mood and performance as much as they do for physical capabilities. And then when we see people that want to transition from women to men, the first thing that they do is they take hormones. And so I see this happening, and I see this in the transgender issue. I see this sort of prescription of how do you change your gender? You start taking male hormones. You're injecting biology into and you have increased levels of aggression. You have increased, and this is self-reported from transitioning women, right? That they have increased levels of aggression, increased levels of sex drive, higher confidence, etc. But then it doesn't square up with this idea that gender is a social construct. And so I think that a lot of frustration that, people that read me and, people that I have followed are feeling is that this blank slate thing is like, I think they really believe it, but at the same time, it's also opportunistic. And then, they can sort of toss it out the window when they want to push a political agenda. And I'm finding, one of the sort of theories that I put forth in my book, Democrat to Deplorable, is that our new political coalitions are going to be forming around whether or not you believe in blank slate theory or whether you believe in some element of biological determinism or essentialism. What do you think about that? How do you see that manifesting itself in our political environment?
I think that's already sort of happening, but in a way like, let's say both Republicans and Democrats, neither of them are willing to acknowledge heritable differences in capabilities, right? And neither of them really are willing to talk explicitly about sex differences, or to connect kind of economic and social policies to family policies or pronatalist issues or whatever. I can imagine a political landscape changing where people do have much more open debates about sort of blank slate versus evolved and heritable traits, but that would be awkward for both parties because it means, if you're kind of a free market, semi-libertarian Republican, and you acknowledge, oh, wait, but there are heritable differences in intelligence and willpower and ambition and mental health, then how do we provide a society that gives everybody a reasonable shot?
Well, I think some libertarian Republican would just even nix that question altogether from the start. How do we provide?
Well, yeah, I don't mean necessarily provide by like redistributing wealth, but I mean sort of creating a set of social norms and institutions and values at the cultural level, not necessarily the government level, that actually give everybody a shot at mating success, meaningful work, families. The other thing is if you take a blank slate approach to gender differences or sex differences, the way that actually plays out is it simply delegitimizes masculinity. It doesn't delegitimize femininity. It doesn't delegitimize women's interests. What it tends to do is puts men in things like couples therapy situations, where a man will say, these are my preferences, these are my values, this is what I'm missing in the relationship. And the therapist, is typically female, will say, that's just toxic masculinity, that's not legitimate, I don't respect those needs, you need to become more like a woman. You need to communicate more, you need to do less stonewalling, you need to abandon your need to like have occasional sexual domination of your girlfriend or whatever. By contrast, women are almost never told your preferences aren't legitimate. You should change them. Your need to communicate all the time about everything isn't legitimate. That's just socialized. Nobody gets told that, right? Or your emotional jealousy, right? Or your emotional jealousy is illegitimate. You need to man up and not feel that.
Right.
So the burden is basically put on men to deny our masculinity on the basis that it's allegedly socially constructed, but there's a total double standard. Women are never really asked to overcome their sort of feminization by culture.
Right. Well, I think that we've hit on enough points to where my argument that there is an attack on masculinity that's sort of structural and endemic to our society today. It's at the national level, it's on the policy level, it's in our universities, it's infiltrated all of our social relationships, it's even inside of our familiar relationships, it's between couples. It's a major and significant issue, but there's still like a lot of shame around talking about this matter. And in your experience tying this back with Tucker and talking about red pill stuff and talking about masculinity and positive masculinity, I'm curious to hear what your prescription would be, because, I have seen, and I'm telling you this year with the Kavanaugh thing, really just, for 10 years, I thought I was crazy. Okay. I thought I was just kind of being a baby, kind of making this shit up, kind of exaggerating these issues, taking things out of context, or misleading data and whatnot. But I have finally submitted to the data, which is ironic because I've been writing about this stuff for a long time, but still there was a part of me that felt impostery or sort of fake about it. But this year, even in the last couple of months, really hammered it home for me. And for me personally, we're not passing any new laws, and I'm not even looking for the government to do that. I'm trying to find a way that men on an individual basis, and then sort of collectively as men, what are we supposed to do, and how do we move forward, and how do we how do we get past the shame element of acknowledging this sort of attack and war, and for lack of a better word, or this conflict, and really get back to sort of a cultural embrace of a positive masculinity for everyone's benefit?
I think we have to be able to articulate, number one, why did masculinity evolve to have the structure it does, right? If you don't understand that human evolution was characterized by a lot of group versus group warfare, and a lot of male versus male fighting and homicide within groups, and a lot of jostling for status because women mated with higher status guys. If you don't accept that, you can't, it's really hard to accept yourself as a man, right?
Right. Men are men because of women, basically.
Men are men because of women and because of, past male versus male competition.
Right, and this is mate selection. This is the power of mate selection.
It's the power of mate selection, but it's also the power of which males win the competition for land and resources and meat and status and prestige. So, we're here. Our dads, our granddads were the winners, right, of those competitions. The ones who lost those competitions didn't typically pass on their genes, and they're not our ancestors. So we have to kind of embrace that and go, for better or worse, that's our evolutionary history. And here we are. Now what do we do about it? And I think second, we have to be able to articulate to women the upsides of men embracing and nurturing their masculinity in a way that is hot and sexy and meaningful and makes for better relationships. Look, women read romance novels where there are bad boys and rogues, pirate captains, Vikings, whatever. That's the fantasy, right? I want a high status, competent, effective, fit guy who can fight and
it's not the deckhand.
And do all that stuff. Not the deckhand, not the gamma Viking boy, child, whatever. And we have
Ragnar.
yeah, Ragnar Lothbrok. We have to be able to remind women, you can have that. You can still have that passion, that power dynamic, that hotness for real in your life, in your relationship, if you just kind of allow men to do that and help them level up and allow them to express that without sort of judging it negatively.
Mm-hmm. In my personal relationships, I have, through trial and error, figured out that that's what works best for me, is my expression of masculinity and leadership and dominance, but not in the negative way that the gender feminists will have you believe. And for me, what it means is really just having a mission, my mission first, and taking care of myself and my health and my physical well-being first. And that's not in a selfish way. That's in a way to make me more useful to society. The model that I've adopted is to, you take care of yourself first, and then your family, and then your community. And then maybe, if you can get that far, you can maybe help your nation and the rest of mankind. But it all starts with you taking care of yourself first. And that, if that means missing out on some family function because you need to go to the gym to get your mind right and to get your body right, well, that's something that you have to do so that you can be present and you can be capable and you can be harder to kill and you can be a more useful contributor to your family. And I think that somehow that message, that physicality, and this is something I emphasize to all my guys, is like, how do I change my life? How do I get better relationships? How do I do better at work? How do I make more money? The first thing you do is you take your ass down in the gym and you start squatting. And I think that that sort of physicality culture gets mocked. And it's there's a shame factor. Man, they use shame a lot, don't they? And I guess what I'm thinking of right now is, if we're constantly evolving, and ideally or theoretically we're moving forward in a way that's sort of like the fittest way for us. Are these ideologies, this radical feminism, this shaming, this anti-masculinity, is this like a anti-fitness? I don't know what the right word is, but is this like a failed evolutionary tactic? Is this something that needs to die?
Is it dysgenic, as we say?
Dysgenic.
Does it tend to favor bad genes over good genes? I mean, it's hard to say, because on the one hand, part of me is like, this is terrible. It's selecting the wrong genes. The gene pool is going to go to hell if this continues. On the other hand, within 20 years, we'll have the technology for doing genetic screening of embryos and possibly even fixing mutations. And so within 50 years, within 2 generations, it probably won't matter that much, how the mating market kind of plays out in terms of which genes survive. It's not like we're in a kind of situation maybe 1,000 years ago where there's no way to kind of fix the evolution through technology. That will happen. I mean, within a generation or two, pretty much everybody is going to be able to afford some kind of genetic screening or manipulation, of embryos that is quite helpful. But I think the short-term problem is just people are frustrated. They can't find mates. They can't have good relationships. Women aren't getting what they want. Men aren't getting what they want. Everybody is sad and frustrated and miserable. And
I'm not.
And there's other countries that are going to face the same kinds of issues, maybe even worse. Like in China, the excess of males over females is going to be a huge issue. And they are going to have to think very, very carefully, how do we structure mating markets and families so that we don't have a catastrophic level of...
No, they're just going to ship like 10 billion guys over the Korean border with knives and spoons to fight another war.
They might do that. They might recolonize certain areas of the world. Who knows? But
yeah. To get back to like sorry, I took us off on that tangent there, but how can a guy today and his partner, his female partner, find the erotic energy that may be deleted by this sort of egalitarian nature of our professional markets and sort of the elimination of hypergamy or hypergamy.
Yeah.
And one of the first things I started writing about was about BDSM, and I found it very appealing because you can intellectually create a space that can tap into like our primal urges and our instincts. And I wrote a lot about dominance in the bedroom, sort of dominance in your day-to-day life, and then leading into the bedroom, and then also some explicit stuff about BDSM inside the bedroom. And I think I've found it personally to be, I'm going to use this word and laugh, but like a safe space to express some of those urges that we have that are stifled by, reasonable societal norms, right? Like, we're not running around just bashing women over the head and raping them whenever we want, right? So, but in a controlled environment, you can create sort of like a fantasy environment that allows us to get that real visceral feeling, real primal energy that if you haven't experienced it, it's kind of hard to describe. So what I know that BDSM is very fringy and it's very, people look down on it because they don't understand it, I think. And I find it personally to be like a very high intellectual, driven, experience where you need a big, high level of creativity and honesty and openness and communication. And it's actually very sophisticated. What role do you see, of sort of fantasy space in sort of tapping into those feelings that can sort of get us through this period where, the mating markets are going to put people together that may not have been put together in the past, something like that.
So I've given a couple talks actually about the evolutionary psychology of BDSM, and I do talk about kink and BDSM in my human sexuality class. I think it is fascinating. There's a lot of misconceptions people have about it. They think it's all about whips and chains. My reading is, the heart of BDSM is basically power exchange and role play. And power exchange.
Consensual, mutually consensual
right,
power exchange. Yeah.
Consensual power exchange, which is like, it's just like kids doing role play. Like, I'm going to pretend to be the pirate captain and you're going to pretend to be my captive. And let's just see how that plays out. Is that cool with you? And if I do anything you don't like, just say the safe word like red and we'll stop. So the power exchange means that a couple can sort of rebalance the power that they might have in ordinary life. Maybe the guy can explore more assertiveness and domination and activity and kind of be a little bossier than he might feel comfortable doing in ordinary life. And maybe the woman can be more submissive and passive and overwhelmed and so forth, or vice versa, whatever floats your boat. And it is a safe space where you can explore your evolved psychology, where, let's say, the woman can explore her hypergamy and she can say, okay, I know, you're only whatever, a journalist or a professor or a lawyer in real life, but imagine you were, a Mongol warlord or a Roman emperor or whatever. Let's game that out. And when people do that, and I've talked to a lot of people who are into kink, they say you discover so many new parts of yourself you didn't know existed or you were kind of vaguely aware of, but you can let them out. You can let them play. You can turn them into an amazing expression of creativity, in fact. And so I wish that more couples therapists would kind of even prescribe role play as a sort of intervention that might help a lot of relationships.
I've never met a girl that didn't like having her hair pulled. I mean, that's almost like a universal statement that I can make. And my sample size is not insignificant. And related, there's tons of squirrels around my house. And just the other day, my little 5-year-old daughter was like, Daddy, what is that squirrel doing to the other squirrel? And I looked out there and they were mating. But in the process, there was like a penetration, and then the male jumped up on the back of the female and just gnawed on its neck and just like bit its neck and bit its neck and bit its neck, and then jumped back and did some more penetration and then jumped back up on top and just bit its neck and pinned it down. And that kind of thing is prevalent, I think, all across animal species. I mean, I'm not a complete expert, but
yeah, it's super. I mean, 70 million years of mammal evolution and 4,000 species of mammals, and the males are typically, copulating so-called doggy style, which often involves a bite on the back of the female's neck, which is kind of the equivalent of modern human hair pulling.
Right.
It's deep, 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 and it's across species, and it's not some weird little thing. It's absolutely standard mammal mating behavior.
Now, what's interesting to me is I find that I find a lot of resistance to kink or BDSM from people who would be considered like traditional right, tradcon kind of thing, and then you find the radical lefties really into it or very open-minded to it. And what do you attribute that sort of difference to, when on the traditional side you think that they may be more aligned with our sort of animal behaviors and leadership and dominance and whatnot, but then on the lefty side, where they want us to all be blank slates and we're all the same, but yet there's a real openness to kink. What do you make about that?
I think that's right. If you go to a BDSM conference, almost everybody there is far lefty, gender feminist, extremely kind of sex positive, but in a very politically correct way. And if you ask a lot of conservatives about BDSM, they think it's weird and degenerate, and like they have a sexual disgust reaction to it. So on the one hand, you could think, well, a traditional marriage with sort of standard like 1950s gender roles already is a kind of power exchange. It's almost like a 24/7
right.
master, not slave, but like dom-sub relationship.
Totally.
So maybe they don't kind of need to do the role play because that's their whole life.
Right. Great point. Great point. Tradcons are the epitome of 24/7 kink.
Yeah.
Geoffrey Miller, quote.
Well, I mean, when I was growing up, in Ohio, I saw a lot of my parents' friends and how their marriages worked, and it kind of was that. And at the time, or maybe later in college, I thought, oh my God, that's so patriarchal and exploitative and weird. But then later, the last few years, I've thought, wait, maybe that was a lot more consensual in a way than I realized. Like maybe the women were actually choosing the guys who embodied that, and they wanted that. And okay, it's got pros and cons, but Just like we shouldn't judge people who go into a 24/7 master-slave relationship as like, oh my God, that's terrible. Maybe we shouldn't judge people who go into a sort of trad life relationship that is functionally equivalent in many ways.
I never thought of it like that.
You know, so I'm working on this book proposal to do a next book that is partly about kind of what can mainstream relationships learn from these different sexual subcultures, right? So let's say you have a mainstream vanilla marriage. Maybe you don't want to do full like flogging and bondage, but what can you learn from BDSM that could help you? That's not too edgy, but that's helpful. Or what can like monogamous people learn from polyamorous people? And I think there's a lot of kind of love hacks and relationship tools that can be learned from these subcultures, including for kind of trad life conservatives. And conversely, I think, you know, standard liberal professional couples can learn a lot from like Christian relationship advice and books, or from trad life books or red pill books.
Sounds like a fascinating book that maybe everybody will read or nobody will read. Right?
Yeah. The danger is everybody's going to read it and go, oh my God, he's trying to be like nonpartisan about sexuality. Yuck.
So we're on the topic of relationships and sort of family formation, if that's not a stretch from where we just were. I'm going to ask you a few questions and lead into sort of another topic here, but what role is the nuclear family playing in the makeup of our society today? And how important is a committed monogamous relationship to sort of our economic development, our cultural development, the sustainability of our society in general?
Oh man, that's a big question. So I think on the one hand, you need a kind of mating and family system that gives everybody a vested interest or a reasonable shot at happiness, at having some kind of sexual relationship and having kids somehow. Now, there's a lot to recommend traditional monogamous marriage as a way to kind of give people civilizational buy-in, where they go, yes, I really want to put down roots, to have a long-term relationship, to raise kids cooperatively in a way that they're not a burden on other people, etc. So it's pretty good at solving a lot of problems. And that is why every major civilization around the world that's lasted more than a few hundred years and that has a big population has normative marriage as the main way that most people have relationships and kids. And of course, the elites are always more polygamous or polyamorous, and there's some people who are left out. But by and large, if you have one man, one woman, then, you know, the young men think, well, I might have to fight for the tribe, I might have to work hard for a while, but I have a shot at like having at least one woman.
And this is done through norms
mostly,
right?
You know.
So this is Peterson talking about, and it's not his idea, right? Like the fact that people were giving him shit over saying enforced monogamy, like that, he didn't come up with that. But this
that's a standard term, and it doesn't. Of course, it doesn't mean physically forced. It doesn't even mean legally enforced. It can just mean,
honey, don't you want to find a young man to settle down with?
Exactly, parentally enforced.
Yeah,
and
so you think that directly leads to like increased stability, economic output, you know, advancement of society, etc.
There's a lot of evidence from, you know, evolutionary anthropologists like Joe Henrich at Harvard and lots of other people that, you know, all else being equal, monogamous marriage is a pretty good system for reducing homicide rates and violence and rape and warfare rates and getting guys to be economically productive instead of bitter slackers.
Right, give them a reason. I mean, men are a beast of burden, but they won't serve if there's no real reason to, right? And kids and a wife are a good it's a good motivator to get your ass up off the couch.
Yeah, so I mean, particularly monogamy plus capitalism is a hugely powerful way to promote economic growth, because it means, you know, both sexes have an interest in maximizing the welfare of their family and their prosperity.
No, I think that there'll be some people right now that would argue that we're drifting away from this monogamous committed model, and not necessarily moving towards willfully, purposely moving towards a explicit non-monogamous structure, but actually a de facto polygyny, as it were. And this goes to the sort of the Chad and the incel conversation, which is where the whole Jordan Peterson comment came from. And I think what I've seen, both through my personal experience and through just talking to basically thousands of guys over the last number of years, is that there's the distribution of sex partners is concentrated in the hands of a smaller and smaller group of men, leaving a larger group of men without this incentive to be economically productive. And this isn't happening for any specific, or maybe it is, policy reasons or whatnot. It's just sort of an evolution that's happening right now. Do you agree that is the case? And do you have can you attribute anything to the cause of that?
I think it's a huge problem that you have, let's say, OkCupid dating apps. They have really good data where like the upper 5 or 10% of the most attractive guys are getting the vast majority of female interest. And the lower 60% are basically not competitive at all. Like they get no interest from women. Whereas with women, it's pretty evenly distributed. Like guys are a little more attracted to smart and interesting and creative and beautiful and younger women, but most of the women have a shot on the dating market, at least of getting a short-term boyfriend. So that's exaggerating the differences between males, the dating apps. The fact that, if you're a really hot, rich, young guy in Manhattan, you can have literally as many dates as you can handle. Professional women in Manhattan have a much more serious competitive situation where, yes, they can find short-term boyfriend, but it's very hard to get a quality guy to kind of commit long-term. So I think the real existential threat to the monogamous marriage system it's not the polyamorous people advocating open relationships that are long-term bonds. Rather, the real threat is this kind of extended casual sex life where people are just doing kind of casual dating and sequential kind of not too serious relationships until their mid-30s, right? And then they're kind of panicking, like, oh my God, clock's ticking.
Right, but where did that come from?
I think that came partly from the absurd extension of educational credentialism, from like only a tiny proportion of people staying in school through their college degree to everybody thinking I need a master's degree. It's the geographical mobility where nobody's putting down roots until they find a partner, but they can't find a partner until they put down roots. And I think it's also a common misunderstanding of how, the fertility curve looks for women, and for men, for that matter.
Right. So I got into a very interesting discussion with a guy on Twitter, a very conservative, very religious guy, and we were talking about this very issue, and he attributed the decline in the marriage rate to basically everything costing more, right? And that you have to have more education, you have to work harder, it takes more time to build your career, people aren't satisfied with their career so they don't get married, financial insecurity. And I kept challenging him to dig another layer deeper, and his brain just wouldn't get it. And I finally just tweeted at him. I was like, the Federal Reserve is causing this, right? Like basically inflation. And that's a very shorthanded way of saying it, but like we've increased our aggregate demand in our consumer markets and housing markets, education markets, and we increased our aggregate demand by what? By putting women into the labor force. And so in some ways you can really trace this dissatisfaction, the delayed marriage, the decrease in fertility rates. You can trace it all the way back through education and all the way back to, people, deciding to stop working in the home and the abandonment of their traditional family structure. And so I'm wondering if we're, look, is this what Trump meant by make America great again? I don't know, right? But I think there's people that look back to that time period, or look back and can just, maybe not even look back with it fondly, but even just look back and can give some attribution to the feminist movement that put women into the workplace, directly leading to these circumstances and environment that we have now. And look, nobody I roll with and myself is going to say that like women shouldn't have any, women should have all the opportunity in the world that they want, make any decision they want. Fine. But there's consequences, right? And so I think we're sort of seeing these consequences today manifest themselves in these disrupted relationship markets and dissatisfaction. And then you get the radical elements of this late wave feminism just exacerbating all of it. And I guess what I'm wondering is like, are we going to find a way to, is there a rational reason to move back towards an emphasis on earlier family formation, stricter enforcement of marriage laws, etc.? Is there a real positive outcome that we could say this is why we need to do this, and what would we do, and is anybody actually going to make any changes?
I think there's a lot of factors that go into people having this deep kind of economic pessimism and fear, like I'm not ready to start a family yet, I can't afford it. Part of it's housing policy, right? Our friend on Twitter, Noah Smith, tweets a lot about how absurdly expensive it is in most major happening cities to buy a house, right? And that's not just because everybody wants to live there. It's because there are actual government policies that are idiotic and harmful.
Right, our zoning policies and our subsidized mortgage markets.
Yeah, all of that. And
filtering down into our relationships. That blows my mind.
And nobody, the politicians and the economists don't typically think about, okay, what exactly are the side effects of minimizing new housing construction in the Bay Area? But it does have effects, of course. I think secondly, as you point out, the two-income couples, absolutely everybody should have the freedom to find a job, but there are side effects, which is that the same house that, a man and a housewife would have been able to afford 50 years ago now costs twice as much because most couples are two-income couples. Of course but people didn't talk about that in the 70s when there was this wave of women entering the workforce, that it will soon become obligatory for most women to work.
Right. They thought of it as I don't want to say a luxury, but it was, this is my choice. This is going to be great. It's going to be great for me. It's going to be great for everybody.
Yeah. And then I think a third factor is over-parenting, this sort of leftist idea that, if it's a blank slate, parenting's really hard because you have the entire burden of shaping these little people yourself as parents, right? All the evolutionary psychologists and behavior geneticists I know are very relaxed parents because they're like, we have a baby. It was born with many, many instincts shaped by millions of years. It's got genes. I'm good. You're good. Our kid's going to be fine.
Just roll with it.
Just feed them and they grow.
Yeah.
And they'll be fine.
Yeah.
By contrast, the blank slaters are the ones who do this coddling and the helicopter parenting, the tiger mothering, all that stuff. And they overinvest in their kids and drive their kids nuts with all the extracurriculars. And it's catastrophic because it means people delay having kids until they think they can do all that.
Well, I have a theory that the reason that the helicopter parenting, I think they now call it bulldozer parenting too, like you have to clear every obstacle out of the way for your child. Why that's become more prevalent is because the value of the egg is more value. It has higher value at the time of conception, and because there's a finite supply of them, it becomes even more valuable. So there's so much more anxiety around a successful outcome. Whereas if you're banging them out from 18 to 24, and you've got 8, and sadly you have a miscarriage, and one of them is a screw up, and it just kind of there was less of a mathematical emphasis on the eggs, and now here we are. This is my last chance. and I have to do absolutely everything I possibly can to make sure that this child has every opportunity. And it's just, I mean, it's really created a mutated market for parenting. And I see it, with my kids, and I'm one of those relaxed parents. But at the same time, I'm also like, here's a little story. I had a friend over with his kids, and my 13-year-old daughter wanted to climb the tree in the backyard. And she's like, Daddy, will you help me up? And I was like, I'll help you up, but I won't help you down. She's like, okay. So she, made the calculation, and she's like, okay. I helped her up, and she was up there for a while. And then when it was time for her to come down, she got, real scared, but she figured it out. By contrast, my friend's kids, he's like, don't climb the tree. You're going to get hurt, and, I'm like, how are we going to teach your kid to try and fail or be resilient or anti-fragile, whatever the word is today, if you're not giving them that opportunity? And, to me, it's all tied together. And when you break it down and say it's like economics and it's policy, it's feminist policy, it's labor force issues, to me, I'm trying to look at the big picture and try to see how, one, we can have these discussions about policy and ideology and philosophy and see, what the outcomes are going to be. But, then I'm trying to turn it into a practical application for people that I know. And I feel like I'm running upstream, with this. I'm at another metaphor. I'm like a fish out of water. It's like a whole weird environment that it doesn't seem to add up to me. And, I don't think that that's getting any better.
Of course, you can see this in exaggerated form in Chinese parenting in the 90s and the aughts after they had the one-child policy. And if you're only allowed to have one kid, they invest like crazy in it. By contrast, like my maternal grandmother had 12 kids. And I think, she and her husband took kind of a more statistical approach. Like they knew some of these kids will get into Harvard and MIT as they did, and some of them will go to University of Cincinnati as they did, and some might not go to college, and that's okay. So you can let the kids be who they are instead of thinking, well, if I don't get them into an elite school and they don't have a thriving professional career, then I'm a failure. Like that's terrible.
So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was I was listening to your podcast with Sam Harris, and in it you said that you had observed a Cambrian explosion of mating options. What did you mean by that, and what is the significance for us moving forward? And try to explain a couple of the things that you observed.
So the Cambrian explosion is this amazing thing that happened in evolution about 530 million years ago, where animals evolved multicellular bodies and nervous systems for the first time ever since life began on Earth 4 billion years ago. And you got this amazing diversification of different body forms, behaviors, biodiversity, and that Cambrian explosion really led to, the whole spectrum of modern animal life, from octopuses to mammals to birds, etc. And I think analogously at the moment in culture worldwide, but especially in American culture, we're seeing a kind of Cambrian explosion of different relationship styles, mating norms, different ways that people can interact sexually, short-term, long-term, whatever. And that spectrum includes everything from trad life, monogamous marriage, to so-called relationship anarchy, which is a form of polyamory where you don't really try to define your relationship or make commitments, to things like monogamish relationships that are a little bit open but not totally open, to polygynous cults, to just standard casual dating, which is its own kind of mating system in a way. And it'll be fascinating to see how this all shakes out and which of those relationship styles actually prove to be viable in terms of people's happiness and well-being and family structure and having babies and all that. And some of them will crash and burn. Some of them won't succeed. And hopefully we'll keep inventing new ones. But I think America has to kind of brace for the fact that this is happening. People are exploring new options beyond monogamous marriage and beyond just casual dating. And it's a big trend. I mean, more people are doing these alternative relationships than are gay and lesbian, for example.
What kind of percentage would you put on that?
Well, people are often surprised to learn only about 2% of people are gay or lesbian. And there's a lot of bisexual women, but homosexuality is a lot less common than most folks think. Most folks think it's about 10%. It isn't. By contrast, among millennials and Gen Z, the proportion of them who are doing some kind of consensual non-monogamy or polyamory or open relationships is somewhere between maybe 10%, 25%.
No kidding.
It's hard to find good data on this, but it's at least that level.
Now, I read a book a while back called Sex at Dawn. You familiar with this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the basic premise was that pre-agricultural Homo sapiens were, the mixed and matched mates, and they shared fruits and berries and woolly mammoths, and they also shared their partners, and that led us, from, carried us evolutionarily up until the agricultural era. Do you think that the remnants of that is still inside of us right now?
I think there's a grain of truth in that, but my model of prehistory is sort of halfway between the sex at dawn model, which is quite polyamorous, right, and the kind of traditional pair bond model that says, well, yeah, our ancestors kind of fooled around a bit when they were teenagers and young adults, but then they tended to form mostly monogamous pair bonds that lasted at least a few years, often a lifetime, and that most kids were born into pair bonded couples. I think it is true. Most kids were born into pair bonded couples. The question is, how exclusive were the pair bonds? My hunch is that we're pretty flexible about that. That if the economic and social and religious conditions favor strict monogamy, most people can do that most of the time. On the other hand, if the social, economic, religious conditions allow more openness, a lot of people would quite like to try that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And particularly if there's contraception and good, safer sex, barriers, STI testing, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, personally, I've been in a long-term relationship, but, I almost said the word committed, but, it is committed. We are committed to each other, but it's also open. And we definitely don't use the word polyamorous. We will use the word ethically non-monogamous. And so there's the precondition for it all is just complete open honesty, a ton of communication, and a respect for how the other person is feeling about things. And what we have found, and what I've found personally most so, is that every time I have a sort of mini relationship with a third party, or even just a single date, I return to my primary relationship rejuvenated and excited and sexually aroused even. And I think that there's some evolutionary rationale for that. I've heard of sperm competition and just a sense that you need to overwhelm other mates that may have been there while you weren't there. And I've at least found personally that some people may argue that having an open relationship would be long-term detrimental. I found for myself that it's long-term positive and helpful and healthy, and has only strengthened the relationship that I have with my girlfriend. And girlfriend, I feel like such an understated word for the level of commitment and partnership that we have. But are you hearing people sort of use that that language and see it as sort of a support structure for a long-term pair bond?
Yeah, I think it can absolutely work that way. I'm in a pretty similar situation to you, like a long-term, highly committed but open relationship. And it can work. It requires a lot of leveling up. There's a steep learning curve. It can be very, very difficult at first, particularly because society doesn't offer a lot of support and norms and role models for that. But I think that is the wave of the future. What confuses sort of traditionalists and conservatives is they think if it's not exclusive, it can't by definition be committed. Or if you're poly, you can't possibly have long-term relationships. Or if you have an open relationship, you can't possibly provide stability and structure for parenting. And that's empirically false. A lot of people can do that. But your deeper point is, can it actually enrich and strengthen a relationship for it not to be exclusive, as long as there's a pretty radical level of honesty, as long as you negotiate your relationship agreements explicitly and carefully, and you update them as you need to, and as long as you choose outside partners also who have the same abilities, who have the experience, who can kind of know where they fit into your life and you know where you fit into their life.
Right, you have to be honest with them too.
Yeah, and you have to be upfront. Like on the first date, you got to say, "I am in an open relationship. Is that cool with you?" Or you say it the first time you text them on.
Right, I was going to say even before the first date.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting, I want to tie this back to sort of our earlier discussions of like some game and sort of red pill stuff. And what I had always understood about game, which I think gets a bad rap, it's people talking about sort of pickup stuff. But really what it is signaling to your partner that you have certain traits that they should find attractive. And I think men that are just beginning their sort of self-improvement journey need to find ways to signal that they have high levels of fitness, to borrow a phrase, when they may not be all the way there just yet. And I think that that's okay. And one of the things that comes up in talks in the sort of game circles is that, in order to keep your partner excited about you, one way to do it is for her to see that other people still find you attractive. And so I think that some guys, they will call that like spinning plates or other phrases, but the idea is that just flirt with somebody who's in a supermarket, and your wife will see it and she'll be turned on, and it'll still add some spark to it. And I guess that the open relationship for me does the same thing. And it's really curious because you go out into the market, the sex market, and you get another data point, for yourself, and you get another data point for your partner. And for me, it's always just been such a wonderful confirmation of how amazing my relationship is, and how much I love her, and how hot everything is, and how we want to continue doing that. And so I think I've seen sort of this evolutionary component to the competitive nature of the sexual marketplace as being a benefit to preserving your long-term spark, which in turn will then give you a more stable long-term relationship, which would be better for your kids, better for the economy, better for all this thing. And so I guess this is a long way of me saying the game and sort of even the tease of an open relationship is good to be good for the country in the long term. And maybe another one of these components that we're talking about, like how are we going to manage our relationships and ourselves as men in this environment that is attacking masculinity, attacking the expressions of manhood and power and dominance and all the things that we've been talking about that have bubbled up all the way into our national politics and all through all of the various elements of our cultures and institutions and our universities and our media and the entertainment and every which possible way that you can take a look at the human experience. This dialogue is going on, this tension, this drama, people call it a war, and we're all dragged into it. We're all a part of it today. And the question for me and for my readers and my listeners is like, how are we as individuals going to do the best that we can for ourselves, and in turn for our family, our community, and then for our nation? And I think that in this conversation, we've covered a ton of those things. And I think we've really put everything into context. And I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your expertise and your graciousness in having me in your home. And I just want to say thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
You're very welcome, Jack.
And I hope that we have a chance to do it again.
Yeah, me too. This has been a great interview, and I'm glad we were able to connect so many dots together.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.